Hello, everybody. I'm Michal, and I'm a former member of the Elixir core team. But I'm giving this update to you because I was supposed to be the closest thing to the actual member of the Elixir core team. But Eric actually decided to come, but you're stuck with me. He decided too late. So yes, what we're going to talk about today is Elixir, touch on the new things introduced in Elixir 1.9, 1.10, mention some future plans, but also maybe you've seen I mentioned in slides not only Elixir core team update, but also Elixir core and ecosystem update. I'd like to include some updates from some community projects. Last couple days I reached out to members of various people working on various other projects and got some updates from them that I'll be sharing as well. So Elixir 1.9. Elixir is on a 6 months release schedule, releasing usually around June and around January. So 1.9 was released last year in the summer and introduced a couple big features, most notably releases and related configuration changes, but also some improvements to the logger, in particular how it deals with overload scenarios, though this is mostly obsolete by 1.10, so I'm going to skip that part, and also improvements in calendar types. So Elixir first introduced calendar types like date time, and naive date time in 1.3, when it was deemed that the community didn't handle this part well. And since they were included in standard library, with each release we were getting more and more functions. The biggest change was in 1.8 when we got built-in time zone database support. But 1.9 also introduces a slew of useful functions around this area. Okay, so what are the releases? So releases, if you don't know, releases are kind of a self-contained directory that you can use for deployment. It includes everything, starting with your application, all the code for it, all the dependencies, all the standard libraries that you need, the whole Erlang virtual machine and its runtime. So it's kind of everything together that you can take as a whole and put on a machine and run. And with Elixir 1.9, it's extremely easy to use them. Once you create a new project with Mix New, it's just a matter of running Mix Release, and you have it. What it provides is a standardized way to manage the lifecycle of your application. So there's a command line tool created that you can use to start, restart, or stop your application. You can also issue RPC requests. So while the system is running, you can issue commands to it to evaluate something. You can also use eval, which starts a new instance to run the command, useful, for example, for running migrations. But you can also connect remotely to the running release and do some interactive debugging, some interactive work while it's executing. So that part is extremely useful. It also includes some tools for running kind of the standard daemon setup on Unix machines, and also install, which installs the release as a Windows service on Windows. So why would you want to use releases, right? Other than the fact that it creates self-contained bundle of everything you might want. It also has some other advantages. One is code preloading. So Erlang VM can run in 2 modes. One which is called interactive mode, which is the default. Whenever a module is called and is not found right now, the code server will look through the code path trying to find the module and load it when it's needed. But you can also run the VM in embedded mode, which requires you to load all the module, all the code up front. And this one is used by releases. What this gives you is that when you load the code interactively, it might be that the couple first requests you get to your service will have increased latency because of this code loading, right? So having all of this done up front means you have more predictable performance. There's also standardized way to do configuration and customization that I'll mention next. And as I mentioned, it's self-contained, and you can also, if you have multiple applications, in an umbrella setup or poncho in nerves. You can slice the set of applications into multiple releases with subsets of the systems to have them run on different hosts in different way. So configuration. So configuration story with Elixir is extremely long and windy. But the standard way of doing it, which is the config exs module, still exists, but it was more specified more that this is compile time configuration for application. And alongside of that, there was a new tool introduced, which is config releases exs, which allows you to configure your release when it boots to do dynamic startup configuration. Releases also introduce support for VMArgs that allow you to specify in a kind of unified way flags for the virtual machine, like various options for garbage collection or memory allocators or some kernel services, as well as configure the system environment on Unix systems and on Windows. So yeah, that was mostly what I wanted to talk about 1.9, because 1.10 was a much bigger release. It was released recently, in January this year. And every time there's this talk about Elixir update, there's those stats shown. So by this, I verified those numbers again this morning. So Elixir 1.10 is over 900 contributors, and there's over 10,000 packages on Hex that were downloaded over 1 billion times. So almost one download per every 2 users of WhatsApp. But by this time, Hex is not only Elixir, right? It's something we all use in the Beam community, and it's great to see it growing steadily. So what features that Elixir 1.10 introduce? Most important thing that kind of other things fall off from it is that it requires OTP 21, drop support for OTP 20, but this allowed to integrate with the new OTP logger that was introduced in OTP 21, as well as leverage some other things that were implemented in there. But as about the logger part, this was a huge change, and basically by now the Elixir logger and the OTP logger are one and the same. They are different APIs for the same system. The integration right now is still in 1.10 is still relatively shallow. So while you have the same metadata, the same log level, the same messages, the APIs are still different. Elixir 1.11 will unify those APIs a bit more. Easier sorting, which I'll mention a bit more in depth next, and the two guard functions, or guard macros, isStruct and isMapKey. So you can actually use destructure maps in guards now. This is based actually on something I implemented in OTP 21, though with some bugs, and the OTP team had to come and actually fix it. They know what they're doing. I'm not necessarily. But yeah, this is a great addition that allows for much more expressive APIs, and you can, especially isStruct adds a lot of expressivity, in my opinion. And yes, again, releases where there was a bit of work done on releases. So there's additional restrictions and additional work on compile time configuration. So now whenever you use configuration and compile time, there's some additional verification going on that you actually, this is doing what you expected and not changing it at runtime and then being surprised why it's not actually applied, while it was read at compile time and kind of frozen in code. And there's also a built-in tar step for releases that allows you to build an archive with all the code, so instead of just being a directory with everything. But let's talk a bit more about sorting. So this is the standard way to sort a list of elements in Elixir. And it sorts it in increasing order. But what if you wanted to sort it in a decreasing order, right? So you provide a sorting function. This is kind of readable, right? If you know the idiom, it's kind of easy to see what's going on. But it's a bit harder when we start talking about dates and structs in general, because Elixir sorting and Elixir term order, like Erlang term order, is structural and not semantic. So if you, for example, have 2 dates and try to sort them in increasing order, you might end up with 2020 before 2019, which is not what you want, because it sorts first by the day field, because it comes first alphabetically and not the year. So what you had to do is provide a custom comparison function, which you can see is a bit ugly and lengthy and not very pleasant to use. So Elixir 1.10 introduced an extended API. So you can provide atoms that tell you which way you want to sort, as well as there's built-in support for this compare function that we used earlier to implement our own comparison. Now we can pass a module that implements this function, and Elixir understands what to do correctly. And you can sort both ways. This is not available only in the sort functions. This is also available in min by, max by, all the functions that compare things work the same way. So yeah, expanding on the configuration, what I touched on earlier. So this is something you might find in Elixir applications, right? So we need to find the database host from the configuration, and we read it from our environment, but we read it at compile time in here. And the problem is that if we later change the configuration and try to start our application without recompiling, it will still use the old value. And that's not what we want. The correct way to do it would be probably to read it at runtime with a function. But this is a preferred approach, but it's kind of harder to discover it. There's nothing that nudges you towards this goal. So Elixir 1.10 introduced a new function called compilenv that you can use to explicitly tell the system that this is a configuration that you read at compile time. And if you later change it at runtime, the boot sequence will warn you saying this value changed since you compiled the code. Future versions will deprecate use of getenv at compile time, so you'll be forced to use compilenv and into this tracking. Another feature is compiler tracing. So Elixir, for quite some time now, had this cross-reference database in the compiler which tracked function calls between modules, reference, structures. It was kind of not really exposed to tools. Various tools tried to use it, but it was internal, so it often broke, and it wasn't a really good support. So now Elixir has a built-in support for it, when you can kind of plug into the compiler's view of the world. This already provided some improvements in the built-in in the compiler itself, so you can kind of skip some warnings. And there's also, it allowed to development of, or like easier development of libraries like Boundary from Sasha. So I wanted to mention it briefly. It allows you to kind of declare what parts of your system are allowed to interact with other parts of it. So for example, when we have My System Web module, it's on namespace, so it works on namespaces. So My System Web module, for example, is allowed only to interact with My System namespace and only exports the endpoint module, so other namespaces from outside aren't allowed to interact with internals. And this nicely integrates with the compiler. So if you use it, you can get nice warnings, for example, in VS Code when using the Elixir language server. There was also some enhancements in the Xunit diffing. So until now, it's used to do diffing between values when you assert it with double equals. But now it also asserts with patterns. So you can sometimes get, and it's especially useful when you have some deep nesting and a huge map, and you kind of don't want to look for 10 minutes which key you misspelled. So yeah, that was Elixir 1.10. Elixir 1.11 is scheduled for June this year. It will introduce another extension to the calendar types, which is strf time, or whatever you call this function. So you can print time in a kind of standardized way. There's an is struct with 2 arguments, so you can verify something is a struct, a particular struct, and there's also support for the map.field syntax inside of guards, or there will be support for the syntax. And related to that is kind of deprecation of some syntax, but we'll get to this later. There's a tighter integration with the OTP logger, as I said, and the Elixir compiler will also start tracking boundaries between applications. So similar to the boundary application I showed before, there will be limited support in the compiler for this. So, for example, if you declare an application as a if you don't declare an application as a dependency, you use a module from it, the compiler will warn you. Then when you assemble a release, for example, it won't be available, right? So you want to be careful with it. So related to this allowing map.field syntax, Elixir has the same syntax for accessing a field in a map and calling a function with no arguments dynamically on a module. And this is a problem with it because the syntax in guards will work in one case but not in the other. So the plan to tackle it is to kind of separate those two through warnings and deprecations. So basically, whenever you call modules, you'll need to include parentheses, and whenever it's a field access on a map, you won't be able to include parentheses. In 2.0, the AST will slightly change to reflect this difference. And yes, with all the logger, there was a lot of work put into it by Łukasz, so I wanted to give a shout out. And the next iteration will support all levels of OTP logger. It has much more than Elixir. It will support structured logging, so you'll be able to log maps or keywords with some structure instead of just strings. This is useful in some setups. And you'll be able to set log levels per module, so not only globally, which should also make it a bit more useful. As far as the community projects are concerned, I wanted to mention HexDiff, which is a great tool for exploring changes in packages, and you'll be able to hear more about it, I think, after lunch today. There's Lumen, which is a WebAssembly implementation, Beam implementation on top of WebAssembly, or on top in Rust, but targeting WebAssembly. And there was a lot of progress done with it. There was, as far as I'm aware, there was a progress report last week and Lone Star. So if you're interested in that, when talks come out, you should watch it. There's a great new HTTP client released called Mint, which is based, which doesn't impose a process architecture. So it's mostly about providing a functional interface, and you can bring your own process architecture to it depending on what you need in your application. The work on the Elixir language server also resumed with a new set of maintainers, and it's continuing pretty well, and the support is really good right now. And there's some more exploration into the configuration space from the community, sort of like 2 interesting projects I wanted to mention. I also talked a bit with the Nerves team. So Nerves is an embedded framework for Elixir. The two big changes were the Nerves pack and the VintageNet projects. So Nerves pack is kind of a boot system for Nerves applications that bring networking, DNS, SSH access, firmware updates, and all of those stuff. VintageNet allows you to configure a network on your devices very flexibly. The Nerves team will be focusing on documentation. Right now it's in multiple places, so kind of the goal will be to centralize it and to make it easy to understand all the different components you have to work with, and also expand the system to work on more devices. There's Broadway, which is the tool for data ingestion and data processing pipelines that was announced last year at this conference. It was only announced with support for SQS, but now it supports Kafka, RabbitMQ, and Cloud PubSub. It's growing really well, has a lot of features, and it's really useful in a lot of scenarios when you need to work with those streaming type of services. And yes, I think that's it from me. I think I went a bit over time. So I will yield the microphone to Brooklyn now. Hopefully this time it will work. And thank you.